А, тут с этой стороны тоже видно.
Что они от нас хотят, Юра?
Все то же самое. Окей. У нас у каждого по 7 минут только.
Конкретно в стране надо говорить или...
И в общем контексте, и в стране нет. Какой у нас порядок? Упс.
Okay. Thanks.
Between the 8th floor and the 6th floor.
It's blast of
And
cold
some
air.
toilet.
People will come in, drift in.
We've got until 4.
Hmm?
It's until 4 or 3:30.
4.
So discussion is the main thing.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Mike Van Dusen. I'm Deputy Director of the Center, and I want to welcome you here for a discussion. I will first just very quickly introduce our speakers. I believe that we handed out at the door short biographies of them, and I think we will go from the other side to this side. I want to say that this meeting is being co-sponsored with Human Rights First and the Carter Center. And to start us off, I want to welcome an old friend, Neil Hicks, who is, I guess, Director of International Operations. Is that right? For programs for Human Rights First. And he's going to say a couple of words about the conference in Atlanta, which preceded their visit to Washington. And then I will proceed right down the line. We will have all speakers speak, and then we will open it up, and I guarantee you that half the time will be for questions. Neil.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure for us to be here at the Wilson Center. I just want to say a few sentences about the conference we have just come from in Atlanta, which was co-sponsored by the Carter Center and Human Rights First. This was a conference which brought together leading figures from human rights organizations from 14 countries, together with some of the leaders of US-based human rights organizations, the High Commissioner for Human Rights from Geneva, Louise Arbour, and President Carter. And it was a conference which focused on the current global state of human rights and the place of human rights defenders as the essential link between the lofty rhetoric about freedom and human rights that we hear so much about from governments and from international institutions and the reality of human rights on the ground. There were 4 main issues, I think, which were central to our discussions in Atlanta, and I'll just mention those which I think will give some background to the comments on the individual countries we'll hear from the defenders to my left. First of all, we observed that there was a damaging global trend to undermine and depart from international legal standards that have served us well for the last 60 years. And in our own context here in the United States, we know this is the agenda of the global war on terrorism, the post-9/11 agenda. But this has had a ripple effect throughout the world and indeed has mutated in many countries to result in human rights violations. As a result of this trend, we are seeing that dictatorships and authoritarian regimes are being strengthened. Anti-Western and anti-American extremists are also being strengthened, and promising trends towards democratization in young democracies are being jeopardized. And all of these trends, we think, are deeply damaging and counterproductive in the context of the real struggle to protect against terrorism. The efforts which we in the human rights movement have had to give to shoring up what we thought were well-established human rights standards, like the prohibition on torture, have diverted the movement from pressing needs in the human rights field, especially in the area of economic and social rights. The issue of global poverty remains with us and remains an urgent priority for the international community, which is not getting sufficient attention. But we also noted, with all of these negative trends, that there are some opportunities at the present time for the human rights movement. There is, I think, an emerging global consensus that human rights are an essential part of the fight against terrorism. We see this in some of the work of the 9/11 Commission here in the United States. We see it in the high-level panel report of the United Nations. And we see it in the report of the Secretary General in March in Greater Freedom. That recognition of the essential place of rights in the struggle against terrorism is, of course, much firmer ground for the human rights movement to work from. And finally, there is this ambitious UN reform agenda, which has been proposed by the Secretary General and which will be taken up at the General Assembly in September. The intention of that reform, as it has been stated, is to upgrade the place of human rights within the UN system. And that is clearly something we would all welcome in the human rights movement. So the next few months will be crucial in seeing how human rights can become a third pillar in the UN system alongside security and development. So in the context of those 4 points, I will hand over quickly to my colleague, Yuri Dzhibladze.
Thank you very much. And before giving the floor to Yuri, I just wanted to welcome Carlin Ring, a member of our Wilson Council, and thank you very much for being here. Yuri Dzhibladze.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting this event, and also our colleagues from Human Rights First and the Carter Center for organizing the conference that we just have come from, and our visit to Washington. We have a privilege of meeting today and tomorrow with a number of high-level policymakers in the U.S. State Department, the Congress, and other important places where the decision makers work. And the main message that we are bringing to them is that since September 11, the world has not become a safer place. And that when the U.S. policy, and for that matter, the policy of Western democracies towards authoritarian regimes and our governments from which we all, the nations that we are coming from, is based on the notion of strategic partnership in the global war against terror. This policy has demonstrated its faulty nature. Not only the world and our countries, our nations, have not become more secure, but under the banner of fighting terrorism, the authoritarian governments have dismantled democratic institutions, adopted anti-terrorist legislation that is a real assault on human rights and freedoms, and silenced opposition, the media, and finally attacks, harasses, and often murders human rights defenders. In that sense, we are talking about both the global problems of consequences of such a policy of strategic partnership, which is ineffective, and the situation of our own countries, which is strikingly similar we are coming from 14 different countries from all parts of the world. And we could easily substitute Putin with Mubarak, Zimbabwe with Colombia, or say Chechnya with many other conflict zones. And we see that since September 11, the situation has gone much worse. Moreover, not only the democratic backslide and attack on human rights is happening, but the important resource that is the members of human rights movements and NGOs are silenced and cannot act as an important resource in ending conflicts, in stopping violence, in bringing more security and stability to different countries of the world. Essentially, the message that we're trying to bring to the attention of policymakers is that there is no security without rule of law, there is no security without democratic institutions and processes, and that this partnership between the United States and the governments of our countries and many other countries of the world should have totally different meaning. That is, include rule of law, democracy and human rights as central part of the agenda, because otherwise it's not working and bringing more insecurity and more suffering. That's the essence of what we've been discussing for 2 days, and we've been trying to bringing it at the level of not only bilateral relations but also at the level of international organizations and the UN, as Neil said. And we see the negative consequences of these processes happening since September 11 on that plane as well, because our governments, under the with justification of their security concerns and the priority of the war against terror, really brush off and completely disregard recommendations and criticism from international organizations, be it the United Nations, OSCE, the Council of Europe, or other regional human rights organizations. This really leads to complete loss of influence and effective mechanism of working of these organizations. Finally, we believe that it is really important to look at the democratic backslide not only from the perspective of the importance of promoting democracy and freedom all over the world, but from the perspective of its importance from the pragmatic point of view, if you wish. We as human rights defenders, probably more than anybody else, feel that when you do not have independent media, when you do not have real political debates, when you do not have your representatives speaking openly and freely in the parliaments, and when people do not have freedom of assembly and freedom of association, the issues of public security are not being addressed effectively. We can see it very strikingly on the example of our own country, in Russia, when the conflict in Chechnya not only continues, but the losses both among the civilians in Chechnya and among the federal troops there are increasing. And the Russian public simply doesn't know much about it because of the media control, and the most importantly, there is a complete climate of impunity for the human rights abuses, which is a very powerful message that is accepted by the law enforcement agencies and public officials across the country, which employ the same brutal methods outside of Chechnya in different parts of the country. The same thing is happening in many other regions of the world, and I'm really amazed how much similarities are between our situations, and that really calls for the need for reinforced efforts to work together between human rights defenders, scholars, policy experts, and political elites to change the inefficient and self-defeating policies of global partnerships against the war on terror, which only brings more insecurity and more terror. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuri. Our second speaker is Gustavo Gall, who is the director of the Colombian Commission of Jurists and very well known to our Latin American program. Gustavo.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to you all and to the Wilson Center for organizing this meeting. As you said, there are many similarities between or among very different countries, but that coincide today in fighting against terrorism by violating human rights. Of course, there are particularities, and we in Colombia, we have some of these particularities. First, human rights defenders in Colombia are facing a very difficult challenge, which is related to the right to life. Human rights defenders are killed in Colombia on an average of 18 each year, and the average was about 12 4 years before. We have more than 100 human rights defenders that have been killed or disappeared during the last 10 years. This is not new, but what is new is that the government is not protecting human rights defenders against perpetrators, especially against paramilitary groups who are the main perpetrators of these killings. Guerrillas also kill human rights defenders in about 10% of cases. But the paramilitary groups, with the support of state agents in some way, with tolerance or with sometimes with direct intervention, are the authors of 19% of these killings. And the government is promoting a bill in order to give impunity to paramilitary groups. And the government is negotiating with these groups since December 2002, and this month, the Congress in Colombia is going to approve a law to give impunity to these groups without respecting rights to truth, to justice, and reparation. Even if the law, even if the speeches made by the government say that they are going to do that, they are going to respect truth, justice, and reparation, but this is not true. They are going to receive impunity, and this is going to accentuate the degree of polarization of the country. This is not going to give peace to the country, and this is made on behalf of the fight against terrorism. A second challenge we are facing in the country is the stigmatization of human rights defenders by the government. This is not new because we have had always officers that made speeches against human rights defenders and accusing us of being terrorists. What is new is that this is made by the president himself right now. President before did not do that. The current president in Colombia has made different speeches accusing human rights defenders of being supporters of terrorism. And this is also a consequence of the fight against terrorism, the way in which this fight against terrorism is implemented. We have a third challenge, which is the abuse of power, the arbitrary use of legal powers against the population against human rights defenders in order to fight against terrorism, which means arbitrary detentions, torture, the essays of dismantling the institutions to protect human rights, like Yuri mentioned, it is in Russia. And this is also something that is being promoted in order to fight against terrorism. This is not good. These challenges are not good. And these consequences of the fight against terrorism are not good for democracy, not for human rights, not for the peace in a country like Colombia. And it is important to know that the United States have a close relation with the government of Colombia, and the U.S. administration gives military aid to Colombia, and this military aid is conditioned to the fulfillment of important progress in human rights matters, especially concerning the fight against impunity. And the government of Colombia is not implementing these conditions, as it is clearly shown by this law that the government is promoting openly to give impunity to perpetrators in Colombia. These conditions must be requested, the fulfillment of these conditions must be requested by the government of the United States. The policy of the United States must be consistent in this sense, and this is an opportunity for the United States to help the Colombian people and the world, the entire world, in the fight against terrorism and in favor of human rights. If these conditions, if the government of the United States asks the Colombian government to fulfill these conditions in order to continue to give military aid and aid to Colombia, this is going to be a very good opportunity to overcome this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Gustavo. Our third speaker is Noma Camelova of Uzbekistan. She is the director of the Legal Aid Society in Uzbekistan.
Thank you
Noma.
very much. Thank you. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much for Wilson Center for organizing this event, and I'm very happy to speaking before such respectful audience. I would like to say that the war against terrorism in developed countries with the true principles justified now in the world, but there is other countries like who uses this kind of justification for other purpose, like Uzbekistan. And the war against terror was indeed great chance to Uzbek government to divert the international attention on the poverty and unemployment, human rights abuses, and all other diseases in Uzbekistan. If maybe you have known that the profile of Uzbek president is dictatorship with thousands of political prisoners and systematic torture and police detention centers. At the beginning of presidency, Mr. Karimov succeeded destroy all democratic oppositions, and all leaders having left the country and seeking asylum against the repressive regime. Indeed, the definition of the terror under the Uzbek legislation very vague and allows interpretation for any kind of any people, any citizens to apply this law. You may remember the case of the Democratic Party, one of the independent party which is not registered, who was actually the name of party is Berg, who was actually accused by the terror law. And the next justification of Uzbek government was against the religious extremism. So-called war against terror was turned into the campaign now to independent civil society. and human rights defenders and any independent persons became on the Uzbek government view as a opposition. So during the last month and last 2 years, and especially after tragic indigent events, human rights defenders became on the very difficult situation. I would like also mention that, however, the recent development in the Western world form and logistically moving the limits civil and political rights. We all observe that Western countries with the long traditions of the rule of law, they're limiting civil liberties, which is impossible for the countries like which have less tradition of the rule of law. I mean, this is the moral responsibility of the Western countries, and I would like to say that developed world have not moral right to step back and disloyalty from the ideas of human rights. And while the West does, while these countries will be back on the civil liberties, and less developed countries like Uzbekistan will be make to the dozen. So this is the, I think, message we have to give now for world community, because this is impossible to have a security without human rights. Human rights is a foundation of the security of any state. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nazima. Our fourth speaker is Dzhibladze Murat. He is the EU Jean Monnet Professor in European Law at Saint Joseph University in Beirut, Lebanon. Also the author, editor of about 20 books. Dzhibladze, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. It's a great pleasure to be here to see the continuity. I believe last time I saw Mr. Van Dusen was about 15 years ago. We were plotting for democracy in Iraq. It took some time. It's not quite over.
May still take some time.
Well, my talk obtains from the same framework that I have shared with my colleagues over the past 2 days at the Carter meeting. But I would perhaps, on the strength of a more hopeful picture in Lebanon than it is the case in Colombia, Russia, or Uzbekistan, put it more forcefully to you as the pressing need, the increasing need for what we may call the Mandela model or the Václav Havel model. And that is the idea that if we want really democracy and rule of law, as we are all yearning for them, to take root in our countries, then maybe the best and most efficient way to do that is to have people from us, people like us, at the helm, very much in the way that the most signal change in the atmosphere of the search for human rights in the world took root thanks to the arrival at the helm in this country of President Carter back in 1976. Now, I come from Lebanon, and as you know, Lebanon has been in the past few months in the eye of the storm, and in the eye of the Middle East storm, if I may make it more precise, which Middle East is also, alas, in the eye of the world storm and has been for a number of decades now. In Lebanon, something signal, something special happened. And in the context of Middle Eastern history, it's quite unique. It is a people's nonviolent movement that has started to effect change. And as you well know, the amount of violence which has been associated for the past 200 years with our region, it is within this context that we should start to appreciate the importance of the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, and perhaps more forcefully, the importance for the Cedar Revolution to succeed fully. It has not succeeded fully, and last Thursday, one like us, my colleague at the university and close friend, Professor Samir Asir, went down to his car, turned the engine on, and was blown up. It is clear that a mood of the ancient Lebanon has persisted. I would say even more. What we have in terms of the continuum of political assassinations in Lebanon, starting with the attempt to kill former Minister Hamadi in October, the assassination of our former Prime Minister, Mr. Hariri, in February, the assassination of Samir Asir last Thursday. They're all part of a pattern which is, if I may put it to you in this way, a pattern of a particular Arab order that needs to change. So when I say we are ambitious in Lebanon, and I think we all need to be ambitious, is because we have a non-violent model that has started yielding some results. But those results are being battered, are being set back day by day by the resistance, and an understandable resistance of the Arab order. Now, the political dimensions of how to go forward with the Lebanese seed of revolution, so that one like us, is at the helm in this country. The particulars may or may not be interesting for some of you. I've tried to put them on paper because nothing is being hidden any longer. I've tried to put them on paper. You can see them in an op-ed in the FT today, in an op-ed in the Lebanese Daily Star yesterday. What I would like to say to finish is that Lebanon is not important. It's not important per se. We are, some 4 million people bickering as hell, with a past which is rather checkered and a civil war no one is proud of. But there is no doubt in my mind that since September, since this resistance, this non-violence resistance, started in September upon the forced extension by the Syrian regime and their crony in Lebanon, Emil Lahoud, to extend the mandate undemocratically over the 6 years that the Constitution has imparted to his being in power. Since we have done that, I have started to become proud of being Lebanese. Now, how to transform this into a model for the region, because it's a model for the region, is something we cannot do on our own. And that's why I think my strongest measures today is to have this Václav Havel model, the missed Samir Asir model, the Mandela model, develop in Lebanon certainly in the coming weeks, with the replacement of the stooges of the ancient order by people more like us at the helm, but also as a model of nonviolent change across the Middle East, certainly in Syria, where we'd like to see people like us at the helm, certainly in Egypt, where my colleague Saad-Din Brahim and the Carter Center with us is the epitome of the profile we need to be seeing at the helm in the very coming months in Cairo, and so on for the 25 or more autocracies of 20 years and longer in the rest of the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shibli. Our last speaker is Phil Matshivza, and he is the founding chairman and executive director of the Human Rights Trust of Southern Africa, a regional human rights and governance institute. Phil.
Thank you. Over the last 3 days, I've always been amazed by the eloquence of my colleagues. And sometimes I've been listening and forgetting that my turn is coming. So I will really have to be quite original, or else they've covered most of the things that we talked about. While the theme of the conference was the situation of human rights defenders in this global fight against terrorism, we did acknowledge that the state indeed does have a legitimate right to protect the citizenry. So we started from that positive angle. But however, we did discuss that security, as all my colleagues have said, should be anchored on the observance and protection of human rights. This was reinforced by the Commissioner of Human Rights briefings on uplifting the status of human rights to a tripod type of situation within the UN, where it now enjoys, it's proposed to enjoy the same status with security and development. So if that be the case, we did therefore discuss that there is need for a balance. The balance between state security and human security. We did acknowledge and observe that the general trend has been the erosion of human rights and civil liberties in the pursuit of our very security. So in preserving our own security, some other people's securities have been exposed. In Africa, we have a saying that when you have a carcass, you know we like our meat. If you have a carcass, don't make a mistake to hire a hyena to guard it. You know what can happen. So if you don't want to hire a hyena to guard your carcass, you need reliable and consistent standards. And therefore, we did recognize that the world needs to go into a reaffirmation of those human rights standards and norms that have protected the world. We did discuss at length and observed at length that the current situation was very threatening when it came to the Geneva Conventions, the protection of people during situations of armed conflict. We also did note that it's not always the allies to terror that have jumped on the wagon and use it for abusing the rights of their citizens. We did observe that the attention sometimes given to the fight of terror also leaves gaps somewhere else, where regimes become roguish and where the space for democracy shrinks and the state is bloating, covering practically every other space that is available. And these are some of the issues in the broader context that I just wanted to reconfirm about the conference. We did also discuss situations like my own country, where today, the last 3 weeks, you've seen a human-made disaster. When I left on Saturday, the government papers, I have to quote the government papers because probably somebody can think that there's an exaggeration if they're independent papers. They were mentioning that about 20,000 people had been arrested in the so-called clean-up operation to get rid of the country of illegal settlements. Now, I was telling my colleagues, for you to imagine, the total prisons in my country accommodate about 19,000 people. So you pick up 20,000, you can see what you have done. But I read actually in some newspapers that now the figure is 30,000. You can see how big it is. And there's an estimation that the situation might have affected about 1 million people. When you have such situations, then you need dialogue, you need discourse, you need people who are able to articulate those situations. Because without this reaffirmation of the international norms and standards, we fail then to get anywhere to turn to for protection. And these are some of the issues that we discussed, but I'm sure that we will discuss a few of them in detail should you be interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. They've been very good. They're ready to take your questions. And please identify yourself and say, ask to whom you would like to address your question, and if somebody else on the panel would like to talk after the major answerer, they are free to do so. The floor is open. Cindy in the back. Yeah.
Thanks. Cindy Arnson from the Latin American program at the Wilson Center. All of you have made reference in one way or another to the impact of the U.S. war on terrorism on respect for human rights and democratic practices in your own countries. And I was wondering if you could be a little bit more specific about that, and particularly address either the reaction in your countries to the Abu Ghraib scandal, which I think we're all familiar with, or general awareness of the kinds of legal changes that have been advocated by various Justice Department officials in this country.
Are you interested in both Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and rendition? Or do you mean just Abu Ghraib?
All three would be, that's a good amendment. And if I could also ask you to address, to the extent that people are aware of the kinds of memoranda that have been drafted as the basis for justifying the kinds of practices that were used in the war against terrorism.
That's a good, easy first question.
Thank you.
Shibli, or anybody. Yuri, whoever wants to go first.
Well, a long question. My position is one steeped in international law. I found it difficult since actually 12th of September to follow the lead that was taken at the Security Council and in this country in the labeling of the horrors on the day previous as terrorism, because we know, and we have known for the past 200 years, legions of lawyers have tried to give a definition that could work for lawyers, and it hasn't. So I don't see why it should work now. Now that it's loaded in this way, of course, we end up in an impossible situation to follow, and the logical consequences become those black holes of law that Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, and other such places are, boosted and supported by our own regimes. Talking about the Arab world, I can assure you that, the Arab League is, next to some of the agencies of the UN, one of the most inefficient and useless institutions that the international scene knows or has known for the past 50 years. But there's one thing that the Arab League has been particularly powerful and adept and efficient at streamlining in the Arab world. It happens with the convention, the Arab Convention Against Terrorism, and the regular meetings of the Ministers of Interior to implement those rules, those black hole law rules across the Arab world. Now, of course, it doesn't help to have Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. I support President Carter and the call by Irene Khan to close them down. It is not acceptable to have a black hole of law in the world. Nothing justifies it. And there is no doubt that it has affected us dramatically in our work as human rights lawyers, because obviously we cannot defend the American position, even if otherwise the American position, as in Lebanon, has been rather forthcoming and supportive of the democracy movement there.
Yuri, Gustavo, any of you that want to speak to it, go ahead. Yuri.
Thank you. Well, I would like to look at it from a political perspective, if you wish, not from a perspective of international law. Well, clearly, for many of our countries, or rather our governments, international pressure and, first of all, pressure and position of the United States government has a crucial importance. At home, when we have very little channels of influence because of overall democratic onslaught, anti-democratic onslaught, international pressure remains almost the only mechanism we can try to employ. And it's very difficult when we talk to policymakers here or try to appeal for change of U.S. policy vis-à-vis our authoritarian leaders or dictators. Clearly, the U.S. policy is weakened. U.S. policy, U.S. pressure cannot be as effective as it could be if there were no Abu Ghraibs and Guantanamo. Our dictators are victorious, they're joyous when these things happen, because it serves as justification for their own crimes and allows them to point at the hypocrisy of the U.S. policies and say, well, you know, if these champions of human rights do that, what do you want from us? What right do you have to criticize us? That's very easy and simple. But that only shows that it's not black and white. It's not only bad guys, the dictators and authoritarian regimes, and the good guys that are just closing their eyes at the crimes there. We all are universally in big trouble with human rights in the last several years after September 11, and we all need to work together to address this issue, both from the perspective of observation of international law and from political perspective of working together and trying to change situation, both from the security standpoint and development of democracy.
Gustavo, do you want to say anything?
Thank you, Mike. First of all, I would like to say, Sandy, that there has been public rejection of these proposals in the country. If you see the public opinion expressed in journals and in oral interventions, there has been a almost unanimous rejection of these purposes. And this is an important data that must be taken into account by countries like the United States, that normal people, common people in our countries are against this kind of distortions of universal values. I only know, second, one exception to that. That was an opinion expressed by a minister of this government, the Minister of External Trade, who wrote an OP, and he said that he was speaking on its own. That means that he did not engage the opinion of the government. And in other words, he said that he was in favor of torture. He made the question about what's the less evil if you find a person and you are facing a dangerous situation and this person has information. It is good to torture this person or to treat this person with some methods in order to obtain information from him, in order to protect the whole society against a dangerous situation. And he answered that he would be in favor of that. And he said that as a personal opinion. It is interesting to know that when this government tries to send a message to the public without being engaged in this, some ministers speaks like this, personal opinions. So this is very dangerous. This is a symptom that what you mentioned, Cindy, have had some effect in Colombia, and maybe this minister tried and the government tried to see what was the support for this kind of opinions in the country. The answer was negative to this question. I think it is very important, I said before, that the US, the United States, be consistent in human rights and in democracy. When President Bush said in his inauguration speech that the government of the United States himself are committed with freedom and liberty. This is an important message that must be consistent with other attitudes in the internal and external policy of the United States and the whole countries, the whole world, and all the countries can develop good or bad consequences according to the attitude observed by the United States in these issues.
Thank you, Gustavo. I think Nazima, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just want to very quickly say, yes, it's obvious effect, because I can give you precisely example. For example, every year we have a OEC conference on human dimension in September or October. So where, there was a very obvious critics from the Western countries and especially from the United States of the violation of the rights journalists or other activists in Russia. So there was an answer from the Russian government. So there is your violation also from journalists' rights in US. So this kind of conversations gives to put less pressure anti-democratic countries. In Uzbekistan also, all these authoritarian regimes, they're very closely following, and they're always using, we have our own democratic way to go to reach the democracy. We have own way. There is no one recipe to reach any democracy. There is, all countries have their own way. So this kind of slogan they used. And for example, last year in 26th of December, we had the elections. And there was the OEC observers which stated that there was not free and free elections in Uzbekistan, democratic elections. The Uzbek president, Mr. Karimov, stated that we have own way to go to democracy. We have a OEC. We don't actually need the position of OEC. We have CIS countries observers, and he gave the example when there was the rights of the observers actually violated in US, and he gave the example, we are not doing this kind of work when the US also violating the rights of the observers. So you see how they use, it's very much effects, I would like to say, and of course it's affect whole these countries like who is going to a democratic way. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazima. Yes, there's one here and then in the back.
Thank you. My name is Maria Aparicio, and I'm a former international consultant at the Colombian office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I would like to address this question to Gustavo Gallón. The Plan Colombia, or the US Plan Colombia, has like a military component, but it has two, like a human rights and rule of law component. And I mean, this kind of programs, that the human rights and the rule of law program has been developed for USAID, by USAID in other Latin American countries. So my question is, what do you think about this program? What do you think about the impact in the country and in the political situation? And which kind of components, like a program developed by the international community, must have in order to address the human rights situation in Colombia? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, indeed, there is a component of social issues accompanying the Plan Colombia, which is in 80% a military aid to Colombia. I think we think in Colombia that it is important. It is important that there is this social aid to Colombia, different than the military aid. But it is very little. It is subordinated to the military aid, which is not good. And we think that the priorities must be inverted. I mean that most or all of the aid given to Colombia should be addressed to tackle the social problems that are at the basis of the internal conflict in Colombia, with programs to strengthen justice, to guarantee the fight against impunity, to strengthen institutions to protect human rights, like the Inspector General Office, the Procuraduría, like the Ombudsman Office, the Defensoría del Pueblo, like the Prosecutor General Office, the Fiscalía, which unfortunately is not oriented right now to prosecute perpetrators, but to protect them. Unfortunately, this is the situation right now. And to fight against discrimination in the country. Colombia has a very high level of discrimination and poverty, and the problems of Colombia have been very well studied and analyzed by the office where you worked, the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights and other human rights experts in Colombia. So, and there are many important recommendations made by them to Colombia. So Colombia is a country that has been very well analyzed, and today all international experts in the world know very well what must be done in Colombia. So I think that more than military aid to Colombia, the emphasis of the help that the United States can give to Colombia is to support the implementation of these recommendations. Thank you for your answer, for your question.
Thank you for the question, Gustavo. The woman in the red, and then the woman at the end of the row.
Pianita Maya with the National Endowment for Democracy. My question goes to Mr. Murat, and I would be curious what your take is on the role of outside players, whether it is the U.S. or the European Union, in promoting human rights and democracy in the Middle East, and how you would evaluate initiatives in supporting domestic democratic movements such as the Democracy Assistance Dialogue, for example. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a large question, and I must say that we have gone some way in this direction, at least on the rhetorical level, which is, I remember trying to influence a meeting of the European Council through Anna Lindh a couple of years ago, where the argument was, look, there is going to be no security, even including the problem of immigration into Europe, if the conditions on the southern and eastern side of the Mediterranean continue to be so tragic in terms of rule of law. Since then, you can see, whether from the rhetoric of President Bush or from the increasing rhetoric at the level of the European Union, that at least this argument has now been taken on board. And I must confess, I don't know, I might have a dim historic view of American foreign policy history, but it seems to me that that the equation that this current administration has made between democracy in the Middle East and national security is quite unprecedented. Even President Carter did not rise to that level of equating the issue of democracy in our countries with the well-being of Americans here. This seems to me the central argument. Now, of course, the devil is in the details. There's the problem of double standards. There is a very, very severe problem of the approach to Israel in this country and in Europe as the sole democracy in the Middle East, which, and this would take us a long way in the discussion, which I'm sure we don't want to embark into. But I think even as a constitutional scholar, I think there's a very problematic dimension in considering Israel as a democracy. So the devil is in the details. It's in the details of double standards in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. It's in the details of continuing to hugging the monarchy in Saudi Arabia when this country has one of the most deformed forms of governance in the 21st century. So we have to keep at it. We have to go through the motions of discussing and fighting on each step. But the curious dimension, and this is why we come back to Lebanon, the curious dimension is that the people are ahead of us. And while we're fine-tuning all these kinds of programs, the street has moved ahead by showing that change can happen in the right direction, and the governments have fallen behind. In other words, I'll give you a very slight example, which is the street has been very clear in Lebanon that the president must go. This is something that the American government, the French government have been fighting back. I know that from thorough discussions with them, but also you can look at it in terms of rhetoric. So there is this dialectic which is promising, but where we cannot be allowed too many mistakes, lest this extraordinary dynamism of non-violence that we saw in Lebanon be served a very severe blow, which will reverberate in 20 further years of statu quo in the region.
Thank you. Shibli, anything on Europe?
Well, there's a problem with Europe because with all their best efforts, we're still seeing old semi-colonial bickering between the forces in Europe. And so it's a bit frustrating. But one thing which is certain from my perspective is that we really don't want to see America and Europe pulling on different sides of the democratic call. We've seen it has been tragic for Iraq. And I do blame it on Mr. Schroeder and Mr. Chirac for their support to Saddam Hussein in this, I think, almost shocking manner. But in Lebanon, the French and the Americans have played it well. In Europe, I was privy to a large meeting of the socialist leaders who came to Mukhtara to give us support at the height of the revolt back in March. It's very, endearing. It's very important to hear them call for the same democratic change is extremely important, and we cannot afford side contradictions between France and England, or between Italy and the United States.
Thank you. Yes, woman on the end of the row.
Hi, I'm Cecily Williams with the American University School of Public Affairs, and my question is related to the agreement that there seems to be widespread of the role of human rights in protecting security and fighting terrorism, but at the same time the seemingly marginalization of economic, social, and cultural rights, both by governments and in many ways by human rights defenders and their reactions to counterterrorism techniques. And I'm wondering if you can speak to how that plays out in your countries and what should be done about it. What are the steps that maybe we can start taking to bring them to the light again?
That's a big question. Who wants to take a stab? Phil, you want to go first?
Yeah. Thank you. As I said, it's a balancing act. Security and the state's legitimacy to protect the citizens under it. And at the same time, the actions of the state, if the acts are impoverishing people, abuse of human rights has been one of the most basic reasons why citizens end up rising up against dictators. It has led to the erosion of the state. In Africa, we're seeing many, many failed states because they're not just delivering anything to the population. Anything that succeeds and is not under the control, they shoot it down. And that increases the poverty of the population. And when that happens, it worsens the security. And then you start seeing also the state having these mirages of security capacity. The weaker the state is, the more visible it wants to be in its security dealings. But sooner or later, it won't cope. And that is the unfortunate side of it. That's why we are saying that security should not just be about the state. We should be looking at security from the human security aspect, where we are including human rights as well. Or else, if we don't, it will really be disastrous. I think that's my contribution.
Yes, Yuri, and then Neil, and then any others.
Well, the danger that High Commissioner of the United Nations spoke about during our conference, and the concern that we all share, is that in the last several years, the fundamentals of international law that were agreed on back 60 years ago suddenly are questioned. And we have to focus all our energy and attention on protecting fundamental civil liberties and rights, because they are under obvious attack. The right, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, access to justice, and other fundamental civil liberties. However, that inevitably presupposes less attention to economic and social rights, because we have as much resources as we do. And that inevitably leads to human rights defenders, international organizations, governments disregarding the issues of poverty and its effects not only on human dignity and living conditions and the rights of the people, but also its effects on security. We see the how in, for example, in Uzbekistan, 90% of the protesters, if not 95, Nazima will correct me if I'm wrong, were out there in the streets not because of, their willingness to protect religious freedoms, for example, of this particular group, but because of their complete despair, because of their social situation, because of their dramatic poverty. And that's a vicious circle. Poverty breeds more radicalism, and when it is combined with destruction of democratic institutions, when the government doesn't speak to its own people, when there is no public discourse, that by definition gives life to radical movements and recruits new radical activists. So that's a real danger. And unfortunately, these issues can be manipulated by terrorists and by radical groups. Like in our country, for example, most of social rights debate, unfortunately, is dominated by nationalists in Russia and the old Communist Party members, not by human rights movement. And this is a shame, I would say. And we certainly should make our best to bring these issues back to the center of our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuri. Neil, you wanted to add to that?
I just briefly point out, we were all impressed in Atlanta by the presentation of the relatively new UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Louise Arbour of Canada. She has recently produced, at the end of last month, a plan of action for upgrading the status of human rights throughout the UN system. And she identifies as the human rights problem #1 in the world poverty and global inequality. And I think this is a widespread recognition in the human rights movement that there is a need to address the economic and social rights agenda with new vigor. And this was the opportunity I was talking about in my opening remarks. I think we have an opportunity now to take up that challenge which the High Commissioner has now set for us very eloquently in her report. And she is a leader, I think, who is capable of injecting some real achievement into the human rights movement's less than spectacular record in the economic and social field. So we look forward to meeting that challenge, and we think we have the right leaders to do it.
Would any of the other speakers like to add to that? I'm reminded of a comment from a former Lebanese prime minister who was gunned down February 14th, Rafik Hariri, used to say that desperate people do desperate things. Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Yes, Peter Nasuti from the Institute for Global Engagement. I think we're seeing in certain states recently, I'm just looking at the panel, places such as Uzbekistan or Zimbabwe, the leaders are in a position where they don't really seem to be caring about their population, that they're more interested in enriching or making good life for themselves or their close associates or family members. And in these cases, it might be very rational for them not to care about human rights as although it might hurt their population, it helps them stay in power. And I think we can see in several regimes, such as North Korea and Cuba, that if you can control the guns, you can stay in power for a long time. Given this state of affairs, what can human rights defenders do?
Bill, you want to start that one? That's an easy one.
I could start that one if there's hesitancy from the panel. But we did talk about hard cases like Uzbekistan, Burma, Zimbabwe in the conference. And we recognize that in many of these countries there are limitations to the role of US pressure and to the role of US-based or Western human rights organizations. We realize that there is a need for regional pressure, for greater concern by governments that neighbor countries which have become gross violators of human rights and which are causes of instability within their regions, like Zimbabwe, like Burma, and like Uzbekistan is becoming. This is a matter of self-interest for those regional governments. And we in the human rights movement, I think, can make that point, and certainly human rights activists in Russia can make that point to their own government about developments in Central Asia. Human rights activists in South Africa and Southern Africa can make that point to their own governments with respect to Zimbabwe, and Human Rights Africa in Southeast Asia can do and should do more of making the point to Burma. That, I think, is the way to approach these issues. And not enough has been done, but I think the arguments are compelling. Failed states in any of these countries are not in the interest of anybody, and least of all in the interest of the neighboring states.
Bill, you want to add to that?
Thank you, although quite a lot of the items have already been said by Neil, which I wanted to say. But what can we do faced with those situations as human rights defenders? That's a practical question. What do you actually do? We have developed a number of strategies. Some don't work, some work in the long term, some instill hope. Quite a lot of variety. But one of the most important things that you do when your space is shrinking is to invest in the populace. The population. Human rights defenders, it's a very small group. But you need to have programs that have grassroots support. At the end of the day, when the going gets really tough, it's that giant called the citizens that will make the difference, and not the few academics who can articulate the situation very well. The other thing is building alliances, building bridges. We have been talking, we have the international community, we relate to them. But in these specific situations like Zimbabwe, we really haven't found the international community too helpful. They say too many things out of 10. And when we have meetings at home, people actually will say, no. Let's see our brothers first. And there has been a lot of engagement to build bridges with the SADC leaderships. We, as human rights defenders, have met leaders like Thabo Mbeki, the Prime Minister of Mauritius, who's the current Southern African Development Community President, people like President Mogai of Botswana. We have met them so that at least everybody can understand that we are indeed in a crisis, and it's to everybody's advantage to solve it, because it's spilling over to the other countries. And we all now acknowledge that there is indeed a crisis in Zimbabwe. There might be different approaches of how to solve it. The other issue is really just combating the pressure of your shrinking space. In other words, reclaiming the space itself. Over the last year, we have had situations like you have heard about the NGO bill that sought to deprive NGOs from receiving funding for governance work. And governance was practically defined to include almost everything. And we had to engage with practically every other player up to the time that the president was persuaded that it was not in his interest to proceed with the bill in that format. We also have been able to have awareness programs in the different areas to try to make sure that the population can tie their economic situation with governance, that linkage. And unless somebody in the street can relate a policy to a state of impoverishment, sometimes they don't then get that invigoration necessary for participation in the public affairs of one's country. So we have a number of programs that do address that. Programs that aim at increasing demand for democracy at the grassroots. When that demand is there, and then it comes back with a demand for accountability. And that is the main role that we are playing in the circumstances that we do have. We don't talk about the rule of law because we have more than enough laws. We really are more concerned about the justice of the law. Because if you say, hey, human rights and the rule of law, they will definitely tell you, you are the ones not obeying the laws, because the laws sometimes are not obeyable, if there is any English word like that. Thank you.
Any others want to comment on that?
Just a small footnote.
Yes,
Given that we are hosted by the Wilson Center for Scholars, no offense was meant by Phil when he spoke about academics and the importance of...
I did note that. I don't know that I wanted to pursue it, but I know that Shibley, for one, on this panel, wears both hats.
Look, if there's something that depresses me is all these dusty academics. You can be an academic and be fun.
Let it be noted that one of the goals of the Woodrow Wilson Center is to bring policy-oriented people and scholars together, and to get the policy people away from their inbox and think long-term, and to get the scholars out of their ivory tower and understand the practical problems of governance. I don't say we always succeed, but that's our goal. Other questions? Yes.
I have a question. Oh, thanks. My name is Marcela, and I'm with the Center for International Policy, and I have a question for Mr. Gallon. It's been mentioned that the stigma of human rights workers in Colombia and obviously all over the world. And I'm wondering, given that there is this, it was mentioned that there was a strategy targeting the population and getting support from civilians, and I'm wondering if there is such a strategy in Colombia. That's one question. And then the second part to the question is there an entity, a government, or perhaps an organization that could serve as a mediator between human rights workers and President Uribe? Has there been an attempt for some sort of, I mean, I know the communication seems to be really shaky, and I'm wondering if there is perhaps a person who has attempted to smooth, that relationship?
No, communication is good. Feelings are not good. We communicate with government. We, human rights organizations, we undertake communication with government as a right. We have the right to communicate. And we fight for that. And we don't need mediators to do that. We have this right. We request the government to discuss with us. We, of course, have the support of the international community to do that, and of the organizations, not only human rights organizations, but social organizations in Colombia to do that. And even with difficulties, we obtain some advances, some progress, we make some progress on that. But the real situation is that this government doesn't appreciate, doesn't believe in human rights values, even if the government uses the words related to human rights for public purposes. The government and the president himself has said that he doesn't believe in the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. And that is grave, that is serious. The principle of distinction between civilians and combatants is a principle of humanitarian law. It's a principle of human rights. It's a principle of democracy. It's a principle of civilization. All society must distinguish between civilians and combatants. The president of Colombia right now thinks that he must not distinguish between civilians and combatants. He has said that we are all combatants. We must be all combatants in favor of the official armed forces of Colombia. And you can find that in the TV, there is an announcement where there is a military commander that says, we are an army integrated by 44 million of inhabitants. That's the pretension of the government right now, to convert the country, the whole 44 million of inhabitants, into the army, the entire army of Colombia. This is not good. Militarization is not good for a society. It's not good for Colombia. It was not good for Eastern Germany. It is not good for North Korea. It is not good for any country. So that's the problem. The problem is that the policies this government is implementing are policies that are not based on the basic notions of human rights. And if the government could change the basic notions, the traditional notions of human rights, it would do it. And it is trying to do it in Colombia. So that's the problem. The problem is not, as I said before, communication, but the feeling that the aim and the intention. But we can try to overcome this situation, because the government, as all governments, must govern our society based on the values accepted and implemented by the universal society. And so that's what we are trying to do.
Any other questions? I want to thank all of our panelists and thank you all for coming. You were very attentive, and we appreciate and welcome you to the center. We welcome our panelists and enjoyed having you here. Thank you all very much.
Monday. Yeah. But, thank you.
It's good to have you here. I will email Amal and say that you will be in touch when you get back. Okay? Great to see you. Great to see you. Nima, thank you very much for coming. Good luck. Very nice to see you. Gustavo, thank you very much. Very much for coming. Good, Neil, good to see you. Yeah, thank you. I apologize. We're changing, I'm out of cards, and we're changing our email address this summer, so I have no cards right now. Well, yeah, we're leaving the Smithsonian with our computers, so our email addresses will change. Not the website. The website will stay the same, but it will be on the website, whatever the new name is. Neil, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
Great to see you again.
I need to return you the
Yeah.
newspaper. I remember about that.
Thank you.
Here's my card.
Yeah, great to have you. I will tell the Kennan people, and I guess Valentin was there, wasn't he?
He's still there.
He's still there, waiting for you.
Yes. Okay.
Good to see
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Thank you for coming.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Well, in the last couple of years, it has been not more but overall, yes, it's been in what and generally good. Are you in touch with? Well, you know everybody there. Probably all the famous people. It's close to Andijan. What language did you communicate? Да? Ты должна уже хорошо сейчас говорить. Well, maybe every yeah. We do work. I'm working closely with NED. They have this thing called World Women for Democracy. Remember with Soros, but it's new. So you recently moved in.